Hello, good afternoon. My name is Wiktor Osiatyński. I'm Polish, but I will run this session in English because the majority at this table are English speaking. There is translation. If someone will be referring directly in Polish, I can switch probably to Polish as well for a second. So it's my pleasure. Thank you very much. At the beginning, I want to ask you to join me in something. We were here today, so myself and perhaps some others could not join and take place in a funeral of Jacek Kochanowicz, who was a great scholar who, like few others, dealt with the transition and economic aspects of transition to market and the problems related to that. And also the day before yesterday, there was another funeral in Poland of Stefan Starczewski, one of the leading human rights activists and defenders, even in the times of communism. I would like to ask you to join me in a moment of silence to commemorate them and also other human rights defenders that have been either died or killed in last years around the world. Thank you, I appreciate it. That actually will turn me away from even you uttering the word, which I've been asking the question for many years recently, are human rights dying? So that much of death, we will now think how to make them vital and revived and as effective as possible. The subject of this session is how to protect human rights in the face of new threats. Well, it's a very timely question because we dealt primarily with threats throughout the last 2 days and only a little bit, including the final statement of Jean-Marie Guéhenno yesterday about what to do between the individual and the globalized world by reconstructing some communities and political community, and some other members talked something about what to do. So I thought how to do this session, and I made some notes yesterday and today, and I thought that I will start defining some threats and ask you to participate, and of course you can add to whatever you want to participate, how we can respond to these threats. I hope there is an agreement about that format. So I was very happy with Professor Rotfeld at the end of the last session, talking about the failed states, or the states, non-states, anti-states and not states, or for yesterday, Jean-Marie Guéhenno described it differently as the non-active or non-effective states. Actually, to me, I think that we were misled organizing this conference and using the word security, because I had a feeling that for many of us, the word security is so much tied with security forces, security apparatus, security secrecy, etc., that we got a little bit lost in that. And for me, basically, security is the essential element of human rights. Human rights do not promise us well-being, do not promise us other than legal equality, do not promise us happiness. They promise us basic political, social, and economic basic security. And of course, the most important element of this security is physical security. That means living in peace or under the threat of war or civil war or something like that. And as we could see in the last session and also in your presentation, keynote speech at the beginning, this has changed. Actually, I will claim that at least in Europe, or in what is called North today, during the Cold War, the world was much more secure than it is today. People, I'm not saying it was better, I'm not saying it was more free, but secure in that sense of the direct threat of some armed people and violent people that could come kill, rape, and exercise sheer force. And of course, this is a question to you. Do you agree with that it was more secure or it is less secure today? But the question about security of that type was also coming up in some presentations or discussion, how to create or to recreate the mechanism that would ensure this security. So for me, that would be the first element to which I would like us to talk about this threat of insecurity and how to respond to that. The second cluster of ideas and thoughts had to do with the terrorism and invigilation and what I call electronic democracy or electronic media, and this undoubtedly is a threat to freedom or in the name of security. I would like to find out any idea or thought, if you can see that this technological development is also a threat to security, not only the threat to freedom. I think there is a lot in that also creates an additional increased threat to security as well as peace. I would like to add some things that were not said, which I was not surprised because there was no time for that, but that is about the methods of human rights. And I learned from Neier, who fortunately is present with us, that with terrorism and many other threats to human rights and to freedom, actually one of the major methods of protecting rights or somehow responding to that, namely shaming, doesn't work. A lot of monitoring of human rights during the Cold War, under communism and other places, was that we monitored very carefully the violations of human rights to be able to come with something like almost legal proof of the violation to shame the perpetrators. And I remember Aryeh's lecture a few years ago when you said, but this doesn't work to terrorists because they take pride in what they are doing. How can you shame them? It doesn't work to many other perpetrators who basically say, no, we don't do anything wrong. Not only terrorists, but also the Islamic State that just emerged and is actually violating basic rights. And it's not only that, it's also shaming in marketized media becomes probably less effective, because shaming in this media is like one more information on the market which counts much less. I would like to ask you a question about another threat to human rights that will be second to last, which I consider important, which is democratization itself. We didn't talk about it. But democracy means, and democratization, and we feel it quite well in this part of the world, is that in democracy, the role of human rights ceases to be central. When we lived under communism, the essential part of that, like in any despotism or authoritarianism, was that everyone could become a victim. No one knew when they knock on his or her doors. And actually, even if someone was high up in party apparatus or state apparatus, they were also victimized, they were uncertain. Under democracy, most people can find strategy of living, working, earning, living, that they will not be knocked on the door, that they will not be threatened. And actually the rights that are violated, and I hope that the Ombudsman will react to that, that the rights who are violated are primarily rights of minorities, of small groups, not of the majority. So now majority may be less sensitive to that. And actually with the development of populist democracy, which is probably the greatest political invention ever, which is based on fear, but not fear of me as a dictator. If I'm a populist leader, and I could put many examples, I say, fear them and I will save you. So with that fear, of course, minorities are even in some way put in the position of victims, because we oppose majority to them and say that's their problem. So I think if any of you has first of all, shares this fear of mine, and then if you have any idea how to perhaps react to this threat. And the last thing, I was very moved, especially today with the Nobel Prize, Peace Nobel Prize for the man in India who was fighting for children's rights and for this young woman from Pakistan. But I want to talk about children's rights. It has to do with human rights activism and the effects, and something which I call human rights doctrine in a sense. So there were examples today given about the child labor. And I remember Reebok is giving human rights award for last 10 years or whatever, because they wanted to make up their very bad public prestige, because Reebok was using child labor for producing balls, and then the human rights activists attacked Reebok, and Reebok said, we are not doing that. That's not us, that is some companies that we are contractors with them, and so they are to blame, and they are in Pakistan and in India, and we don't have hold of them. So this very wise and shrewd young people said, okay, whatever is, we won't buy your products. And there was a boycott of Reebok products for some time, and Reebok, of course, responded to that, because we don't think with ideas, we think with our wallets, primarily. So Reebok started undoing that. And now there is these labels, there is no child labor, etc. And that was very big success of human rights, which was horrible, horrible. Because as a result of that, a number of families, poor families in India and Pakistan, lost the only income they had from this child labor. So now I'm not for child labor, but I'm asking why Reebok and human rights organizations and human rights activists didn't come in Pakistan and in India and other places to schools and said, listen, we have this problem. To finish sewing the ball inside, you have to do that inside. You have to have a very small hand to get into that. This is child hand. So how about in every class from, let's say, grade 4 to 7 in school, you will have 2 hours of practical work for school children, and in return for that, all school children will get lunch from us and also packed lunch for their families. That would solve 2 problems. These children would be in the school, there will be labor for that. For them, the Reebok would get what they need, and the family would get packed lunch. And I'm asking that question because it is not that much about threat, it's about violation. But I'm asking about imagination in human rights protection. How we can get to something that will bring to some positive results, at the same time protecting human rights. So basically, I finish with that. I'm opening that up for this round table, but I'm not closing the subject. You can come with whatever was, and I may also add additional questions, but I just put this 4 or 5 things for your reflection at the beginning. Thank you. Aryeh.
I will start on the question of technology. You know, in various ways, technology can be used to violate human rights. At the same time, technology can be used to enhance the protection of human rights. In the 19th century, the invention of the telegraph made it possible for newspapers to have war correspondents and to be able to report on what was happening in armed conflict. So in the Crimean War and in the American Civil War, there were war correspondents who were covering the conflicts. And that had a very significant role in bringing about the development of international humanitarian law. In the United States, a man named Francis Lieber wrote a code of conduct for the forces of the Union with 157 articles, and most of it is comparable to the protections in international humanitarian law today. And without the newspaper reports of what happened in armed conflict made possible by the telegraph, that would never happen. More recently, if you think of the war in Bosnia, we saw the siege of Sarajevo on television because satellite television had just come into use. And because of satellite television, it was possible to broadcast directly from Sarajevo to the rest of the world, and that was helpful in terms of trying to protect lives today. Human rights organizations are able to disseminate information very rapidly about human rights abuses because of the availability of the internet. So technology can be used to violate human rights. Technology can be used to protect human rights. Technology itself is not the problem. It's really how one takes advantage of it to protect human rights and how one resists the violations of human rights that are also made possible by technology. The increased surveillance that is made possible, for example. Or if you take what Jean-Marie Guéhenno was talking about yesterday, targeted killings and assassinations. It's very difficult to evaluate the availability of drones. Drones, in one respect, could be an improvement because if you engage in bombing, the plane flies over quickly, it drops a bomb, many people can be killed. If you use drones carefully, the drone lingers for a long time, and you can try to use it when there are fewer civilian casualties. But the drones can also make it so much easier to engage in targeted killing that it increases the violation of human rights. So the technology can either be used for good or for ill. But what matters is how one engages in the effort to try to protect human rights, not the technology per se.
Floor to Ms. Szymielewicz and then Zehra. I want to say an anecdote which is important. 2.5 months ago, I was with Mr. George Soros in Ukraine, and we had a meeting with, among others, not Poroshenko, but primarily Avakov, who is the Minister of Interior. And he said, we need only one thing. That is 2.5 years ago. We need the short and medium range rockets that will have very, very precise target, 10 square meters or whatever. Because we cannot fight separatists that are among the houses and buildings in towns where our population is, and we cannot stop them crossing the border, but with this we could. And of course they didn't get it. There were two reasons they didn't get it. First, that the West didn't want to give any offensive weapons because they were thinking about international conventions, etc. And second, which was told to me when I tried to be a middleman on that, under the table, if we get that to them, which is very modern technology, some of Ukrainian forces will sell it to Russians within 2 days. But whatever it is, this technology probably could have changed the character of the events in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, if it was available. But, Pani Magdalena,
Thank you. On the point of technological neutrality, I fully agree that technology as such is not a human rights problem. I would never debate it as such, although the more I deal with technology myself, the more I watch and observe how the society reacts to development of technology, I stop thinking that it's completely neutral. In terms of human rights violations, Aryeh just gave the example of drones. I strongly believe that the use of drones for targeted killing wouldn't be so easy if it wasn't for the mediation of that technology. If these people were there killing these people directly on the ground, certainly the problem would look different. And the same if we talk about phenomena like hate speech in an online environment. I'm the last one to advocate that we should limit anonymity online for the hate speech purposes, but I appreciate there is a difference in offending or attacking somebody directly and doing this with technological mediation. So this is only to say that technology does change a lot in the way we relate to one another, in the way we can build some empathy or understanding of the harm that we cause through the violations. And therefore we should appreciate that difference. I'm mentioning that because the solutions, now I move to the actual answer to your question. I wanted to suggest soft solutions before we move to hard solutions such as new regulations or criminalizing new acts. I do think we should work more with the perception of the harm involved in human rights violations, which is exactly related also to the use of technology. What I really mean, talking about mass surveillance and linking to the democratization issue that you mentioned, one of the problems. I think that mass surveillance, we are all victims of mass surveillance. We should never think of that as a minority issue. Although people tend to think so, that it's not me who is concerned. What we have to change as human rights advocates, on one hand, is to explain to people the real impact, so give them evidence showing what Agamben and Foucault and other philosophers wrote years ago, that the red line between me and the terrorist is just today. Tomorrow I might be on the other side, which might be my egocentric incentive to stand up for human rights. It's a pessimistic what I'm saying, but of course I would prefer to live in the world where people fight for human rights just because they believe in human rights, but I don't think it's the case. So if we work more on the empathy and also evidence collection to prove to our citizens that really the risk of you becoming the victim is very real. The moment you try to protest against the power, the current political power in Poland, France, US, wherever you go, the moment you become active, the way we are active, you might actually become subjected to human rights violation. Or as a client of a big corporation, you might become subject to certain harm, even though we don't see it as human rights issue, we see it as a harm. So if we collect more evidence of that sort, we might be able to address these issues also and appeal to the imagination of people who normally tend to think they are the majority, the silent majority that doesn't react. And only the second solution, I would say, is jurisdiction. I don't believe so much in regulation, state-level regulation anymore. I don't think that in terms of human rights, governments have incentives to really adopt strong regulations against, for example, mass surveillance. But I still believe in courts very much. If we start challenging the same practices all across the globe, at least all across Europe, we might end up with a few strong judgments, like the ones we already got from European Court of Justice. And that might be a point of departure to fight for new laws. Thank you.
Przepraszam za pomyłkę, w imieniu czasem swoje też mylę. Zehra, please.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to go to your first question, if we are in a safer space now or less. And I think I do agree with you. The things were perhaps in certain ways were more secure, and especially this I would say that for when it came to for social and economic rights. And although, again, the universal agreements on the content of rights have been always a bit debatable, I would say that in the at the time of the adoption of the Universal Declaration, there was more of an agreement. And here, just like I'm going to focus on the US, not because I came from there, but it's a key player. US in the 1940s had a political leadership that had commitment to the full spectrum of human rights. Roosevelt's were important in that aspect, and after the president's death, Madame Roosevelt, being a part of the Commission of Human Rights, was in tune with the Soviet bloc, and so in certain ways, like they, not in terms of everything, but recognizing the full spectrum. Afterwards, there was diversion, and the US really became more and more again, moving to the liberal conceptualization of human rights. It's important to note that it's like, while Universal Declaration was adopted in 1948, it took almost another 20 years, the 1966, to accept the two covenants. And it took another decade to have them ratified. Now, number one, that there was a split. Number two, the time lapse is telling us the divergence that was taking place. And so that's, first of all, that's like first blow, I would say, that coming from the US about again, this not taking some aspects, some human rights seriously. By the time we came to the 70s, Carter administration, which was supposed to be the pro-human rights administration, would refer to social and economic rights as aspirations. They were never rights. Then came the Thatcher and Reagan era. This, like, the then welfare state started to be dismantled, and we moved to the neoliberal economics zone. So when it comes to social and economic rights, definitely we are in a less secure place. And then with the collapse of the Soviet system, that is like whatever the security is there were also lost as well. I would like to point this, like, another advocacy group for the social and economic rights would be unions, and that has been steadily in decline, the unionization. So we lost that ground as well. About other insecurities, that is like, I want to bring something that is not mentioned, as I'm coming across as a very much a critique of the West at this point. I'm aware of that. But the arms sales, that is, yes, we have all of these conflicts around the world. Yes, we may have certain fundamentalisms. Yes, we may have certain groups that are not committed to human rights and so, but who are arming them? The United States, France, and Russia are leading, again, the countries when it comes to arms sales, and then that they are not really held accountable on that. One last point I want to say about the method of protecting human rights, and this is going to be a bit of the criticism of the advocacy groups. I think that there is too much, this is not just my opinion, quite a bit of study, actually literature is accumulating on that, the professionalization of the human rights advocacy and too much reliance on lobbying and maybe within that process a bit more just like getting too cozy with some violators or potential violators is taking place there. I think what is lost in this professionalization process, which has its own advantages, but the notion that human rights struggle is actually a political struggle, and it has to be going on continuously. You cannot say, okay, we achieved, and then relax. It has to be just like one needs to be vigilant all the time. And there is quite a bit of it, again, this like depolitization that has been taking place there. I think the way to, in terms of method to go is to bring that, the mobilizing the people, having them through various processes actually claim their rights themselves, not just rely upon some international NGOs or again, lobbying groups. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Jean-Marie Guéhenno. I want just only to remind you that the title of our conference is Freedom and Security in Globalized World, not only human rights. There are some other things, and I'm grateful that you brought into the issue of public policy that will be into that. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I wanted to try to answer some aspects of your question on technology, and then your last question, the example you took of the children's right, and I think it's a very interesting one. On the first point, on technology, and I agree with previous speakers that technology is essentially a multiplier for good and bad, and it opens new possibilities. I think one mistake we make today is because there's one country that is much more advanced in technology than any other, in the United States. We don't pay enough attention to the fact that eventually technology comes to many countries, and that we see the United States a kind of benevolent user of technology. But for instance, the drones, apart from a variety of issues that have already been raised, I mean, as the practice of drone strikes develops, I mean, many other countries will be using drones. And that's a rather fundamental challenge to some key concepts of the Charter of the United Nations on what is authorized, what is not authorized, and what defines an aggression. If we have a very loose understanding of what is possible, what one can do with drones, is just an example, you're going to have a very serious erosion of international law, and we don't need that. And I would make the point that it is important when the technology has not been fully developed yet to think of the international regulatory framework. It's much easier to do it when the practice has not yet been consolidated than once it has been consolidated. And the progress of technology in drones and many other areas opens new battle spaces, so to speak. And those battle spaces raise questions that are not answered by traditional international humanitarian law, or you need to adapt the concept of international humanitarian law. And the time to reflect on that is now. Now, on the question of children's rights, as I was listening to you, I was thinking of another example where in the US Congress passed a law on conflict minerals being mined in eastern Congo. And the assessment of the impact of that on the welfare of the Congolese people is at best mixed, because you have a lot of very poor artisanal miners for whom it was also, just like the families you were referring to, the only source of income. At the same time, it's true that those conflict minerals, they support awful militias, so the problems is not simple. The issue is not simple to address. But I think there's a general point that can be made on that basis, is that the idea that we can just leverage the power of big markets, of multinational companies accessing all the markets of the world to improve the internal situation of a country may be a bit naive, because what prevails in the end is the power relationships within that country. And it's, one could say often the same for sanctions too, that those in power will always be able to shift the pain to the weakest. And so that the ultimate answer in the end is how you can influence the power relationships within the country where you want to improve security and the basic security of the people. That you cannot do it just from the outside by leveraging the market power or whatever you have. If you don't address in a much more granular, much more specific way the internal dynamics of that country, you will probably miss your goal, your objective.
Professor Kędzia, please.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to touch upon a couple of points. The first question is the security and human rights. And we are usually putting it in this way, whether we want it or not, human rights versus security. And I must say I regret that the concept which was developed in the 90s and then beginning of this century of human security has been somewhat abandoned. And this was developed in the report by Sadako Agata and Matthias Sen. And somehow it is on the shelf. This was a concept which integrated various aspects of security. I think it could be really helpful. And I'm not sure why it happened that it has not been followed. Perhaps there were no driving forces for that, but nevertheless, I think that this concept really was demonstrating that human rights are not just in opposition to security. The concept of the security of the state has been separated from the concept of the human security. Both certainly overlap to a certain extent, but it's not necessarily the same. So this is one point which I want to make, and I think we need, if we want to really to analyze the relationship between human rights and security, we have to keep this human security concept in mind. The second issue which I wanted to quickly address is the question of technology, and I certainly agree with Professor Neier, who says that the technology, and the previous speaker, that the technology can have a positive and negative impact. I think that one of the issues which is extremely important and could constitute a threat to human rights, serious threat to human rights and to the security as well, is the divide in access to technology. And this divide is deepening. And this is a problem which, the question of the access to technology is really a challenge ahead of us, how to deal with it. There are certainly some of the steps taken which are encouraging. For example, now the Gilead Sciences, they produced this first effective medicine against hepatitis C. And a few months later, again, they offered it to the market for $80,000 a treatment. And a few months later, they offered this for generic production for $1,000. So it would be interesting, by the way, to analyze what motivated the company to act so swiftly and quickly and in this way. It's an interesting development. I don't think that this criticism of the divide of the access to technology is just missing the point generally, or is not listened to, but this is a problem which should be taken in a much more comprehensive way, in my view. Now, the question of democratization and human rights, I think that, and minorities in this context, which Professor Osiatyński mentioned, I think that there are some dilemmas which need still to be addressed, in addition to the old one, the majority rule versus minority rights. Today, we are saying that the best way to protect minorities is to grant autonomy to them, particularly when these are the concentrated minorities. But, the real challenge is that the granting autonomy, or let's say applying the concept of constitutional democracy, the power-sharing democracy, particularly in the post-conflict societies, is very often leading up to the situation that this high level of autonomy is protecting rulers within the autonomy when they violate human rights of the members of the minority. And this is also a dilemma we have to keep in mind, because we are facing now everywhere that this is we are successful at one level and then we are going one level deeper, and it's a real problem. So the question of responsibility of government and so on, and media, the last point that I want to mention, I think that we have to revisit the issue that power must be linked to responsibility. We are facing now, also with the electronic means, but not only with the electronic means, we are facing a situation that, in fact, the more impact, influence media have, the less responsibility they, in fact, bear for their action. It's very difficult, in fact, to hold media accountable.
Now, from now on, if someone comes with such a brilliant idea like now, I will interrupt and ask question, how will you attach responsibility to media?
Now, this is exactly what the international community has to take up. I don't have now...
Come with the idea for debate.
Sorry?
Come up with an idea to debate.
Yeah.
How? What would you
Let
do?
me
Or any one of us?
Let me reflect. Everybody of us said this would be a great idea. Yeah.
Thank you. I'd just like to make a few comments on your story about child labor. It seems to illustrate three criticisms that are often made of human rights advocates. One is that they're too careless about the consequences of their policies. The second is that they take insufficient account of the cultures of the societies in which they propose to introduce human rights principles. And by cultures, I would include economic and social arrangements. And the third is that they tend to propose oversimplified solutions to complex problems. Those three criticisms overlap to some extent, and it seems all are involved in the story of the child labor. There is a tendency in various quarters, including the UN and even the World Bank. The World Bank has become rather conscious that many of its programs failed, and failed because they thought that clever economists in Washington could solve all the economic problems around the world. I've noticed in various UN documents, reports of special rapporteurs, documents from the High Commissioner, there's increasing reference to the application of human rights principles with cultural sensitivity. Now that phrase is not usually explained. Your particular solution, I wouldn't like to comment on, but it seems to me that the general nature of the solution, which I mentioned earlier today, is there needs to be a stronger contribution from the people who are to benefit from a human rights policy. Now that's much easier to say than to do, but strengthening NGOs in the sort of countries where child labor practices, to identify NGOs, if there are any, that deal with this problem in the country, who understand the complexities of it. Now, these are very easy to say, as I said, difficult to do, but I think there is a movement towards empowering, seeing that the problem of protecting human rights for the most vulnerable people, and that would certainly include children, and particularly children in very poor environments, involves empowering those people and not simply giving them the gift of human rights. And I think human rights advocates are very nervous about making concessions to something called cultural relativism. But the view I'm just beginning to articulate, and I haven't very far, I think would actually strengthen. I think the universality of human rights is actually strengthened if it is more sensitive, more informed about the social, economic and cultural context in which human rights policies are to be implemented. I think that's at least the direction. And I think that wouldn't provide easy solutions to the problem you raised over child labor, but I think it would move in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wanted to join the voices that speak about neutrality of technology, and I especially like the formulation that was proposed by Professor Guéhenno, which is about this multiplier effect. I would, however, add to it one additional thought. You have discussed this multiplier effect and the power of technology in the context of countries, and this distribution of technology, again, in the context of other countries which might not be as developed. My proposition is that technology actually, I would say it empowers, that is the reference to the multiplier effect, and in fact, it does not empower countries. It empowers individuals.
By individuals, I mean each of us, I mean states, governments, I mean corporations, anyone, right? And that's quite a powerful thought, because then if we think about the spread of technologies, they don't necessarily spread through the state level, through the countries. They can go directly and reach certain individuals. And I think that can, again, link the technology to all the benefits that we can gain for the social and economic rights. Think about small businesses that can thrive through the use of technologies, through the ability that before only bigger businesses had to reach, for example, clients around the world, right? We have the examples of fantastic removal of social barriers through technology, where, for example, stigmatized women in India are able to conduct business through online means, removing the stigma just because they are acting, exercising their economic rights through conducting an online business. And they are getting customers, making money, and this leads somewhat to social inclusion. That being said, obviously technology is of dual use, and while we can see it empower humans, individuals around the world to communicate better, we see this communication turning against human rights and the society. We see other tools, drones were mentioned, right? Drones, of course, can be associated with killing, but they can also be associated with, let's say, bringing medicines to the distant areas which you cannot reach otherwise, right? So it's definitely a dual use. Think about 3D printing, another technology that can be interestingly deployed for the social benefit, but also, unfortunately, for social detriment. On top of that, I think an important factor when we think about empowering individuals is that technology is progressing fast, and with the progress, it's becoming cheaper and cheaper. That's why, again, I would like to stress that this is something that has effects on the individual's level as well as the bigger organization's level. That all leads to a conclusion that with this widespread of technological progress and the accessibility of technology that you have correctly mentioned, that still remains a major issue, but with the building down of the costs of technology, this accessibility is slowly being more and more solved. There is one thing that becomes more important than ever. It is education. It is raising awareness of the use of technologies, that these are the tools that everyone starts to get access to, very easy access, and that they need to be used in a way that is consistent with our vision of democracy, our vision of human rights, rather than the opposite. This means that there is a certain mission to be fulfilled when it comes to technology education around the globe. It means not only technology education in countries like our country here in Poland, but it means also more distant countries. Fortunately, here also technology somewhat comes with help, because there are many educational tools that can be used. Think about Khan Academy and fantastic courses that they are offering. But I think just beyond the simple education on different science and other typical trainings, I think it's very important to think about the ethical dimensions of the application of new technologies, and this in itself becomes quite an important mission to be fulfilled by the human rights organizations.
I think there are two advocates to what you just said. One is Jean-Marie Guéhenno.
Yes, no, I think you raise a very interesting question, whether technology is an equalizer or not. And personally, I'm not sure. And that is not just a question of the unequal access to technology, but assuming that everybody would have access, does it create a level field or not? It's doubtful, frankly. I think sometimes there is the illusion, because we see, what do we see? We see the enormous, and the growth actually of companies like yours, I mean, Google and a few others, enormous concentration. Success goes to success because there are, I mean, the benefit of accumulating knowledge on how consumers react, etc. All sorts of issues that you know better than I do, that has in effect led to enormous economic concentration of major corporations. When you look at the internet, you see how, I mean, of course, everybody with a minimum of technological savvy can create its website. But the reality is that there is enormous concentration. So in a way, it raises the questions that our chair was raising on democratization and the tyranny of the majority. So I think we may be making on technology the same kind of mistake that we made on market economies, the notion that they are self-correcting. And market economy, we have learned the hard way that it is not always self-correcting. I'm not sure that there is a built-in mechanism in the way the internet is developing that will guarantee that in the end all voices are heard. I mean, it could become a very powerful instrument for the tyranny of the majority.
So I have second advocem myself and then Patricia. So my advocem is the following. How about the incredible and growing power of people who control technology, including your company? And how about the abuse of that power or selective use of that power? And here definitely horizontal mechanisms for checking that power are absolutely needed. Second, that perhaps science fiction, but I understand and I read about it, that with the growth of technology, electronic technology, and with exclusion of great number of people from this, we actually may be developing two species. And now I think that human rights issue is actually to protect the rights of the species that will not have access to technology as others, and also the use of that. And final question, three of you said about neutral character of technology, but you said about amplifying effect, and I somehow think that the perpetrators of the violations of rights probably make better use of technology than the defenders or protectors or their victims. So is it, first of all, that calls for social and political mechanisms to protect the weaker? Second, if anyone is technologically wiser and much younger than me, perhaps there could be technological methods of looking some fail-safe mechanisms that will make it more difficult to use technology for evil things. But I think if on that, or we should go into order, Pani Kasia, on that, so sorry. What? Okay, so then, okay.
Right, okay, so I can just do two ad votems quickly to the technological issue. So first I would be very careful of the argument that by definition it gives more power to individuals than other entities. I think by definition it's the other way around. And really even the use of social media that was so often mentioned as something that helped in revolutions, with a huge irritation for all human rights defenders, especially those from the Middle East. I mean, how can we say that social media enabled protests if we know how much they enabled oppression, killings, imprisonments and all that? So really with the mass surveillance conversation, I'm convinced that we see more use and abuse of technology, more effective use and abuse by the states and big corporations than we see by individuals. But addressing the question how we can build in technology some safeguards, of course there's the whole in privacy area, for example, there's the whole conversation of privacy by default and privacy by design. So certainly technologists already are inventing or proposing inventions that would have that safeguards built in. Technologically we can do it, but it's always a human choice at the very beginning what technology we are building. So I'm afraid we cannot build that in a science, in a way like we cannot prevent our brains from producing technology that kills and technology that causes abuses and oppression. But we can regulate, maybe self-regulate, maybe regulate European Union funding, or start regulating very early in the process of production, so that technology that kills or is designed for oppression is not developed. At least that can certainly be done, and it's been discussed.
So now Patricia, Saša, Aryeh, and whoever else.
On the technology issue, I think you're talking about mostly communication technology or military technology, whereas there are all other kinds of technology, and the high-end, top-notch technology will always be advanced for the benefit of big business. And this is, I think, the greatest danger, among other things like distribution and access to it. So that's the thing. Obviously, there is no one fixed normative effect to the usage of technology. Water can save your life and you can drown in it. It's more or less the same. But my concern, and we haven't talked about it almost at all, say for the panel which you, Professor Rotfeld, led, is the weakness of the state. I'm very much concerned with the weakness of the state today. And if there is, because the state is still the only entity, recognized entity, that has coercive means and financial power at the same time, but is getting weaker and weaker. And when I look at Oxfam report that says that, for instance, Qatar and Russia only gave 3% of their fair share for Syrian refugees to the UN, and France gave only 50% of their fair share for the Syrian refugees. There are 9 million people internally and externally displaced. This is all happening in our European neighborhood. There are people drowning in the Mediterranean probably as we sit here and speak now. Now, Germany is the country that declared the biggest number of refugees that they are ready to accept, and this is 10,000 people, but everyone else declared less, and some countries didn't declare anything. So I think this is the greatest test for European solidarity nowadays. What's happening in the south and in the east, and the countries are the ones, the states are responsible for it and should act. And finally, a point on poverty. Poverty is thought of as a 19th century concept, or I don't know, something that's long gone, we've dealt with it, it's all fine now. No, it's not. Even if the numbers and statistics show that people are getting richer, and then there's this global middle class emerging in India and China, by the sole fact that these people, that the fewer people in poverty live next door to rich people, makes this conflict very valid, and a conflict that will amplify in the future, is my opinion. And I think we've grown in we are very now, we've grown a thick skin to the images that we see on the internet, on TV, in the movies, to pictures of poverty and human suffering. But when you see it yourself, when you see it with your own eyes, only then does it make an impression. And this is something we're lacking, because we don't see that. I guess people don't like to see poverty. So, in Egypt, people say that when you're rich, you're free. And when you're poor, you're not. And I think it's very true.
Thanks. I would like to share some thoughts on a question. Why citizens are so readily willing to trade their privacy, their liberty, their human rights for promises of security, or promises of some electronic services which they didn't have before but now seem so necessary. And that would be partially a reflection to your thoughts, initial thoughts. What is the concept of human rights today, and how is it seen in eyes of ordinary citizen. Because it seems to me that it is seen like an elitist concept, abstract one, which forbids someone to tell sexist jokes, but doesn't really relate to everyday's issues. Let me try to make a comparison of East and West before this new era and now. So-called West had very developed political rights for their citizens, but economic and cultural and social rights were not as much developed. It was the free market who took care of that part of our lives, and it wasn't really strong concept in the West. Whereas in the East, political rights were not as strong for people. However, probably over-regulated economy has given birth to a very strong concept of economic and social rights. So when this divide was brought down, we ended up with citizens who felt that, yes, they were empowered politically to speak out and to elect freely, but somehow they lost their economic and social security. And when they looked at us, human rights activists and guaranteers, to provide an answer to this, we didn't have it. We said, well, your unemployment is not exactly what our projects and activities and seminars and workshops are all about. And we lost contact with them. Do we explain to them what it means when they give up their privacy? Did we explain it at all enough? I mentioned a frequent statement, I don't care about eavesdropping, wiretapping, I don't have anything to hide. Did we explain that if a teenager, if his electronic and communications habits are monitored, that maybe 15 years later he will be a minister, and that the habit which he had and which isn't exactly popular at that time might be used to influence his decisions untransparently, to influence his decisions, which will influence lives of all of us ordinary citizens, and the contract on agriculture will be signed in a way which it shouldn't be signed. No, we don't engage in that kind of communication enough with our citizens. Do we explain them that the budget for security which we are giving every day could be used to fulfill some of their economic and social needs? Do we ask our security providers for results? We are very easy on giving green light to new expenses for high-tech military equipment, new programs and drones. Are we sure that we are getting enough for our money, and that money wouldn't be well or better spent in some other ways? I'm not sure. So maybe having these discussions in more depth would bring us closer to everyday life, and citizens would be more eager to join us in our concerns and limitations that we would build for protecting our security while living in a secure world.
I'm going to say, because I want to challenge the history which we just heard. I think the idea that the East in some way dealt with social and economic rights is crazy. A country that was committed to economic and social rights was China. At the time of the Great Leap Forward in China, which was 1958 to 1961, somewhere between 30 and 36 million people in China died of starvation. They died of starvation because Mao's economic policies completely disrupted agriculture. The cadres in the countryside had to report that Mao's economic policies were working, and so for a long time Beijing didn't even know about the disaster that had been created throughout the country. And of course, once they did know about the disaster, they couldn't embarrass or they couldn't criticize Mao's economic policies by reporting the famine. And so there was no effort to solicit international assistance for the people who starved to death. And so in purporting to protect social and economic rights, they murdered effectively 30 to 36 million people. Other than the number of people who died in World War II, we know no episode in all of human history in which that many people died, and this was in the name of the social and economic rights of China. What we learned from Amartya Sen and from others is that the circumstances in which you avoid a famine are circumstances in which you have a free press, in which the government is accountable, and that we have never had a famine in a place anywhere in the world where you have a free press and government accountability. That civil and political rights are in fact the best guarantee of social and economic decency for people that we have, and that the idea that somehow in the communist system there was protection of social and economic rights seems to me to completely reverse what we know about history.
Well, it seems to me that we have here on the table at the moment so many issues which could be discussed that it is a need to make a selection. And I would like to take up what Saša Janković said about this nostalgia for the security which was offered by the previous system, that system which in fact could be defined in different forms and ways. But I do remember that one of the German musicians told me in the mid-70s that it is the system which could be described in two words as institutionalized ineffectiveness. And in my view, it was, I would say, to the point that one cannot expect that something what was inefficient was, I would say, offering a kind of the higher security, also social security. But it is not that problem what I would like to discuss. It seems to me that it is the problem of some legal norms which, as you said, were initiated, I would say, by the end of the 40s, like Universal Human Rights Charter. It was not legal, but it was, I would say, kind of the political declaration, which was later on taken up by conventions and ratified altogether 40 years after the drafting and offering as a kind of the declaration, not a kind, but it was a declaration on human rights, and one day later the declaration on genocide. Both of them were ratified 40 years after by the United States. Now, this is, I would say, for the intellectuals or students, scholars, an interesting point. But from the point of view of the social and political impact, I have to say that quite often political acts are much more efficient than legal conventions. However, by lawyers, and here around this table, there are some lawyers, they would definitely discuss, and they are not able to accept that something what is political. And I can speak about the human rights in Europe, for example, the decisions taken by the
Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, the Helsinki Final Act, was definitely much more influential inside of all the countries than the two conventions which were ratified and totally forgotten. Nobody took them as a kind of the instrument to implement some basic human rights. Having said that, I'm speaking about the future. I would like to say that many people who are undermining the role of the United Nations or the role of many other institutions, because institutions by the definition are static. They are established in the given historical moment, and they reflect, I would say, the political and social situation in this moment. International relations, life is dynamic, and the situation totally different. At the moment, I would say, a lot of the procedures, norms, and even principles of the United Nations Charter are totally irrelevant, but they are still, I would say, with us. Like, for example, just to give one example, but in my view it is very paradoxical and interesting, the provisions about the enemy states in Article 53, 103, 107. It is, I would say, enemy states, all of them, that means Germany, Italy, Japan, Finland, Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary. These were enemy states. What kind of content is behind this is totally irrelevant, but nevertheless it is within the charter. Another element, military stuff. And there are a lot of other, but at the same time, there is a need to see, I would say, the role which was played in the past and still is played by the United Nations in very, very important areas, and they change, I would say, the reality, including human rights, but they are not reflected in the Charter. In other words, my intention is to say that we should not be very much attached to analyze, I would say, the letter and the text. However, it has to be done, but on the other hand, it has to be seen not only the text, but in the context. Now, in order, I would say, to overcome this contradiction between the text and context, I would suggest, I would say, and I made that suggestion not only in the form of the comments during different meetings, but it was also in the form of a formal initiative and proposal presented to the United Nations Secretary General and General Assembly, and of course, as many other proposals, was totally ignored, and nobody is. At the moment, one can offer this once again, and people will consider that it is very fresh. And I would like to say there are a lot of such ideas which are haunting over the United Nations. I have in mind that one should be a little bit innovative in search for the new instruments. I have in mind, for example, that people try to revise, let's say, United Nations Charter. It is impossible. In my view, it will be counterproductive. One should forget about it. But what is possible to prepare a kind of the new political act for the United Nations for the second decade of the 21st century. And in a sense, one can say that Old Testament is still with us. However, the New Testament reflected totally new philosophy, I would say. The philosophy of the New Testament was much more oriented, I would say, to what much more based on friendly and positive, I would say, emotions. When the Old Testament was rather rigid, and it was about the justice, not about the love. But it is another problem. We are not theologians, and it is not my intention to discuss. I would like to say that now we are on the eve of this type of the New Testament on different levels, including human rights. And you mentioned here, I would say, by the way, on the margin, the problem of the arms sale, illicit traffic. And I would like to say, yes, it is a problem, and it is a very serious problem. But one should see that in the proper proportion, because I would say it is less than 2 or 3%, or even less than 2 or 3% of the military expenditures. In other words, we have military expenditures which are more than 1,400, now probably 500 billions. And illicit traffic is about few billions. It is not about 30 billions or 50 billions. It is about few billions. We have under control, and I have to say that it is by many. But what is important, not so much, I would say, to take under consideration the illicit traffic, but I have in mind, for example, this what is known as conditionality, that the arms and weapons, they were in the budget of many poor states, very high percentage of the budget. And at the beginning of the 90s, it was elaborated the concept that those who are spending or they are raising their military expenditures could not expect for the economic assistance, economic support. And it worked. It is now forgotten by many, but nevertheless it is still with us. And I would like to say that this conditionality should be seen as the element of the possible, I would say, steering of development. And the last point, what I would like to say, that the human security, which was mentioned here, it seems to me that by the end of the 90s, it was the new, very important element of thinking about the new generation of the human rights. Now human rights are less and less à la mode. It is, I would say, it is discussed here, but in fact, the best period of the discussion, international debate about the human rights is behind us, because we are confronted with a lot of the elements which were unknown in the past. And in that sense, it will be important, I would say, to be a little bit more oriented on that, what really is new and what are the new risks. And very often, in my view, these risks are seen in proper way, but sometimes they are, in my view, over-exaggerated. And terrorists, killers, perpetrators are much more in the center of the protection by the human rights than those who should really be protected. Thank you very much.
Thank you on this very optimistic note. Now I will have to somehow combine responsibility with power. We finished that first round of our exchange. We have less than 20 minutes left. Aryeh, Anna, and Eva have to catch planes on time. So we have to finish. So you have now 2 minutes for intervention, and I have 2 devices. This is stopper, which will count the time, and this is the bell that I will ring after 2 minutes. Okay, so who wants after that? Stern warning, okay, Zehra, and then Katarzyna. Zehra.
Just very briefly, I am just going to point out that all of the points that are raised, including the things I said, actually, they're pointing to one important thing. There are power differentials. There are power differentials between countries. There are power differentials among countries, within countries. And give it technological advancement, give it access to arms, give it whatever, again, it's like the more freedoms. When opportunities are created, these power differentials will work in such a way that the populations that we probably try to target to help, as people who care about freedom, security, or human rights are less likely to be the beneficiaries, and we have to keep that in mind. So it was mentioned that the big business will be the beneficiaries, and I'll just give an example. The Wikipedia was supposed to be this very democratic, open, no expertise, everybody can share their knowledge and put it up there. And now we learn companies hire people to revise Wikipedia entries about them. And I'm sure governments do the same thing. So it's subverted. And we have to keep that in mind. That's when I said, like, the power, I'm a political scientist, maybe that's it, but power is at the center of everything, and we have to keep that differential in mind.
Thank you. Very briefly, just if I were to mention one main thing that I would advocate for in terms of solutions, right? It would really be working with people's perception, and that's what I already said, but also Saša gave more arguments that I would like to build on. So yes, we need to rework people's perception of how human rights relate to their day-to-day lives, what exactly can be the harm of ignoring these issues, what is the power. We have to expose the power. That's obvious, but then how we do it, how we go about that. One thing I already said, looking for evidence, but that's partly the job for investigative journalists or media, but also for us, human rights defenders. You do work with people on the ground, maybe more than I do being in Warsaw and working on surveillance. We should really try to cooperate more as human rights defenders or activists for collecting evidence. But also there's a huge issue of exposing the financial aspects of power, the whole security industrial complex, the whole trading in arms and surveillance methodologies. Whenever we ask these questions, of course the answer is from the state. We will not tell you because it's what? Security issue. So that brings me to the point on transparency. That's yet another battle. It links to our battles. Without transparency, without good FOIA laws and good judgments really of the courts helping us getting information from the state or from private companies, we won't be able to expose these problems that we need to expose to prove our point to ordinary people. Thank you.
Well, just briefly, I am a little bit scared about this vision that everything will be just done by power and market. It sounds to me let's say, very interesting in terms of the cold shower, but not as an advice how to shape our life. I still believe that there should be some methods and actors who can control both power and market to a certain extent. The problem is that when we empower them to control, then we will have dictatorship. This is why I, perhaps bias on my part, why I believe in human rights, because I think these are just criteria for assessment. What will be done out of them depends on those who will take them forward. And, for example, I will finish this in 2 minutes indeed. We are talking about business, about corporate sector. And finally, in the most liberal state of the world, in the United States, there is a Todd-Allen Act with a jurisdiction of more than 50 cases about the conduct of companies outside the US. So there was a need to have more than just market powers to regulate the issue, but I see your eyes. Thank you. No, it's over. Now we can continue. This is a fascinating discussion, so thank you very much.
Well, and my conclusion would be about the evolution of institutions, because the whole progress of democracy has been organizing the balance of institutions within states, the executive branch, the legislative branch, the judiciary, and fine-tuning that to protect the security of the people. And now we see that there are actors that are as powerful or more powerful than those institutions. So there is a kind of disconnect between the institutions and the realities of power today. And so we need to address that. And I think another facet of that problem is that modern democracy, as opposed to the concept of democracy among the ancients, was about the separation between the public and the private sphere, and the right in a way to choose a private life, if you wish. And that choice is becoming more and more difficult. And that separation is eroded by everything that we have been discussing. And that raises questions including for transparency. We are all for transparency, but it does raise problems, this absolute of transparency, because again, coming back to what you were saying on the tyranny of the majority, the right to privacy, the right to obscurity is one element of, can be one element of freedom. And if we answer in a pessimistic way the question on how the development of new technology distributes influence, then actually the right not to be transparent is going to become absolutely essential, because otherwise the tyranny of the majority combined with the effectiveness of new technology will be overwhelming and terrifying. So I'm more raising questions than providing answers, but I think we see that Montesquieu today doesn't give the full answer, which for a Frenchman is a very painful statement to make.
Well, I would like to say that for obvious reason, I would say we have a tendency, all of us, to say something in very simple form and concise. And the scholars, they have a kind of the intention to present, if possible, their main messages in the form of the model. Model, by the definition, should be well organized, logical, consistent, elegant in presentation. International life is neither consistent nor logical, not elegant at all. And it has to be taken under consideration that this is, I would say, the problem for the politicians and decision makers. What has to be done in order, I would say, to implement some very important elements. By the way, one of misunderstandings among the students is very often that they are considering in very literal way interpreting the concept that nations and individuals are equal. They are not equal. They are equal before the law, but they are not equal in substance. And what we are saying about great companies and I would say the transnational, I would say huge financial consortia, etc., they are quite often much more powerful than the states. Altogether, I would like to say that it is my first point that one should not make a kind of the, to put in equal way the concept of equality. And second point is that in the past, the distinction between that what was external and internal was very clear and obvious. At the moment, the distinction blurred, and very often when we are discussing a lot of problems which were the subject of our consideration yesterday and today, they were seen in the past as internal. They were protected by the non-intervention into internal affairs. Now all of them are a legitimate subject of the international discussion and to a great extent also some decisions.
very briefly, I'd just like to link the discussion about market power with the issue of minorities that you raised. There is a theory in social psychology, the theory of displaced aggression, which is quite illuminating here. What the theory says is if people are frustrated in their lives, which many people, perhaps everyone is to some extent, they will act aggressively in the wrong place. The aggression will be displaced under certain specified conditions. One is if they simply don't understand the cause of their frustration, and markets are very difficult to understand, or if the cause of their frustration, if they do know what it is much too powerful for them to tackle. And the theory has been applied to many real-life instances of persecution of minorities fairly successfully, that people will blame available and vulnerable groups, usually groups that are culturally dissimilar from themselves. And I think if studies of the rise of right-wing groups in Europe, anti-immigrant groups, anti-minority groups, can at least be partly explained by this idea of displaced aggression. And one of the features of markets is, and indeed of technology, is that it's actually quite difficult to understand. We have a sense of its power, but we don't really know how it works, and we certainly don't know what to do about it. So it's much easier to go and blame a vulnerable minority.
And that is actually probably we are coming to the end of the conference. So I want to suggest that we have a topic for the next conference, Love in Society and Politics, and you can address that. That is Professor Rotfeld's implication. I thank you all panelists for this panel and for your contribution.
Szanowni Państwo, to działa. Chciałabym bardzo serdecznie podziękować za fascynującą dyskusję, za udział w panelach naszych wybitnych ekspertów. Również dziękuję bardzo moderatorom za świetną moderację, Państwu za udział w dyskusji. Chciałabym jeszcze powiedzieć, nawiązując do tego, co wczoraj pan minister Boni powiedział na koniec swojego wystąpienia, że pan profesor Bronisław Geremek importował ze świata najważniejsze sprawy, o których dyskutował wówczas demokratyczny świat, a my staramy się pozostać w tym nurcie jako fundacja, która ma za zadanie kontynuację jego dzieła i myśli. Bardzo Państwu serdecznie dziękuję raz jeszcze. Zapraszam na konferencję w tym formacie za rok, a również na inne wydarzenia fundacyjne w ciągu roku. Dziękuję Państwu bardzo.